Good morning, Sierra Bible Church. My name is Glen, one of the pastors here, and it's my great honor this morning to be able to share with you from God's Word. As I was thinking and preparing for this message today, I was thinking about movies and just how many of the movies that we watch are really centered on the desperation of a main character. You know what I mean by that? So some of the movies we see, people are experiencing trials and suffering and pain, and they get to these places where they're desperate and they're willing to try anything, right? So you think about the movie Castaway, for example, and Tom Hanks, as he's there on an island by himself and waiting, he's not getting picked up. He grows desperate enough that he makes his own raft and gets out on the ocean, just goes out in the middle of nowhere, right? He takes it into his own hands in his desperation, and he moves. Or you think of the movie Taken, for example, with Liam Neeson, as he's there and he has his daughter is abducted, and then he has a particular set of skills maybe you're familiar with, and he ends up going down and just cracking heads in on everybody and takes desperate measures to try to get his daughter back. And just like you think of the movie Lord of the Rings, right? As that's the second movie where they're at Helm's Deep and they're overwhelmed by everybody and they're just throwing everything at them, and they've kind of run out and doing all that they can. They're in a desperate place. And like so many of these movies just center on people being in desperate places, right? And I think we resonate with those kind of movies. Nobody wants to go and watch something where everything's fine and happy and no conflict ever happens, right? It's like the story of it, the conflict happens, the desperation happens, and then there's some kind of resolution. And I think it resonates with us because so often we find ourselves in similar situations, not necessarily on stranded islands or having your daughter abducted by criminals, but we find ourselves in situations in which we have very little control and very little ability to take things into our own hands, or we try spending everything we have to get out of something, and we know what it's like to feel desperate. But of course, the big difference between the movies and our own lives is often things don't get better in the end, right? Often the things that we endure do not find the resolution so neatly as they do on the film and on the screen. We are in a series right now in the Gospel of Mark where we are looking at the teachings of Jesus, the ministry of Jesus, and how often the things he's teaching, the things he's doing run contrary to our natural wiring. They run contrary to the way we think the world normally works. Jesus typically does things unexpectedly or differently. And I think this is no different in the story we're going to look at today. When we think of the idea of desperation, being at your wits' end, having spent everything, we think that's horrible. We think that's bad. We kind of shy back from it because we all hate feeling desperate, don't we? But in the kingdom of Jesus, we're going to see that tool of desperation, or that reality of desperation, becomes a tool in Jesus' hands. The big idea for our text today is this: Jesus alone is the cure to desperation. Now, we've been following these last couple texts as we've been following Jesus. Jesus has done two really big things in these last two passages. Remember, 2 weeks ago, Jesus, after preaching a long time, got super tired, wanted to take a nap in a boat. They go across the lake, and a storm hits. Jesus gets woken up from his nap, not by the storm, but by his disciples. And what does Jesus do? He calms the storm with a word. Half asleep, Jesus rolls out of bed and says, "Stop," and it does. And Jesus demonstrates this authority, this power over the weather. And then last week, we looked at what happened when they got to the other side of the lake. As they got out, there was a man who was there who was possessed by a demon, who had been inflicting self-harm onto himself, and it was dangerous to others. And we come to find out it's because a whole army of demons were living inside of him. And this army of demons, as it faces off against Jesus, falls to its knees, terrified of him because of who he is. And Jesus, with a mere word, again, commands the demons to leave. Jesus has just demonstrated his authority over the weather, over the demonic powers. And we're going to see Jesus flex his authority even more in these two stories we're going to be looking at that are there's one main story with one sandwiched in between. So with that, let's jump in. We're going to actually start in verse 21 this morning in chapter 5. And here's what it says. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter's at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she will be made well and live." And he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. So Jesus and the disciples, they go back across the lake. Remember, they got actually kicked out. They didn't want Jesus there. He'd caused too much of a disturbance. So they said, "Get out of town." So Jesus leaves that kind of Gentile, non-Jewish area. He comes back to the Jewish side of the lake, gets out. And as he gets out, already he's got a crowd waiting for him. It's like they had never left. They were just waiting for Jesus to come back. And they start gathering around him again. And in the midst of this, we meet a man named Jairus, who's there in the crowd, who approaches Jesus. And the text tells us he was a synagogue ruler. This is kind of like, so the synagogues is where the Jews would meet. It was kind of like similar to a local church. And the synagogue ruler was kind of like a pastor, except he didn't have the teaching responsibilities. He was in charge of the maintenance of the facilities and the setting up of the activities and scheduling and this kind of stuff. And so it was a very high, important position, well paid. And if you were in this role in your community, you were a pretty important person. And so Jairus is an important person who has a serious problem. Now, what's really interesting here is we've been used to, up to this point, religious people, when they come in contact with Jesus, how does that usually go? Well, they don't like Jesus, right? They end up contradicting him and getting arguments with him. But this story kind of serves to show or prove that not everybody was opposed to Jesus among the religious elite. This man, Jairus, was open to Jesus. And we see why. It's because he's in a very desperate situation. He comes to Jesus. He says, "Jesus, my little girl's going to die. Come and heal her. I know you can make her well." And so the circumstance that he finds himself in is that his daughter is about to die. She is not doing well. And likely, Jesus is his last hope to have his daughter healed. He's likely tried everything. He's likely gone through every step to try to see his daughter made well. It has not happened. And so even though it's not going to look good in the eyes of the rest of the religious elite, Jairus knows Jesus is going to be the only shot my daughter has. So he goes, he meets him and says, "Please, and come do something." And how does Jesus respond? He goes. He agrees to join him and go back to see his daughter. As they go, the crowds, like, it's just having your mind as you're picturing this story, having your mind that it's not just Jesus and a couple of his disciples and Jairus rushing back to the house, but rather there's hundreds of people closing in around Jesus, all there, wanting to get a piece of the action. And so they're going about, and I love this word, thronged. They're thronged about him, right? So it's just this kind of jostling. It's almost like a mosh pit all around Jesus as people trying to get close to him. And they start this journey back to Jairus' house. But there's going to be an interruption. Look at the next verse, verse 25. "And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment, for she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I'll be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease." So as they are moving towards Jairus' house, and the crowds are all around, there's a woman that shows up in the crowd. And Mark tells us her condition. He says that she's had this flow of blood for 12 years. Essentially, she's been on her period for 12 years straight. There's issues going on, and this would have been very traumatic for her, not just for the inconvenience of something like this, but rather because of what it implied, what it meant for her. For a woman to be on her period was to be considered ceremonially unclean. No one would be able to touch her. And they would have to go through a process to be able to be clean again and come back. And it wasn't a moral thing, but it was just a scenario in which God demanded perfection. And God demanded complete holiness. And to be in this state would have been unclean. And so for her, she would have been unable to engage in worship for the last 12 years. And more than that, she wouldn't be allowed to have anybody touch her for 12 years. Because if they did, then they too would be unclean, and now they would have to go through this whole process to right things for themselves. She would be unmarried. She would be childless, which in this culture would have been particularly devastating for her. So she's isolated. She's probably wrestling with purpose. She's wrestling with the pain of what she's enduring, and she's been trying to get the situation taken care of. She's gone to doctors. She's gone to physicians. She ends up spending all of her money over the course of these 12 years. And every time she went and saw a doctor, she only got worse. She spent everything else to not only is she isolated and alone and distraught, but now she's also in poverty. She has no money left. So she has to beg while being unclean, while being cut off from everybody else. She had no more options. She's in pure desperation. There's nothing she can do. But then she hears about Jesus. She hears about this one who could be the Messiah, who's out here teaching, who's out there casting out demons, who's healing other people. And she hears about Jesus and she believes he's the answer. He's going to be able to fix my problem. But of course, the problem is he's a holy man. He would be clean. And for her to touch him would make him unclean. And so she does something really scandalous. She decides in her mind, look, I don't even need to touch him. I just need to touch his clothes. So I just need to sneak in there and just tug on his coat, and I know I'll be healed. So that's the plan she does. So she goes out into the crowds. She's there. She's keeping a low profile. And she sneaks up behind Jesus as Jesus is walking. The crowds are jostling, and she goes up and she touches the hem of his cloak. And immediately, Mark tells us, she's healed. Like she feels it in her body, completely restored in that moment. The whole 12 years of sorrow and pain and isolation in an instant is going to be taken away. And she's got to be shocked, like, this thing worked. And she makes her way out, trying to back up. Maybe no one will be any wiser that she was even there. However, somebody does notice. Look at verse 30. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowds and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And Jesus looked around to see who'd done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease." So Jesus, as he's walking with Jairus and his disciples, as they're being jostled by the crowds, feels the power go out of him to this woman. It's great. It's one of these instances where you see both the humanity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus kind of in the same place, because Jesus in his humanity is not expecting to heal somebody in that moment until all of a sudden he feels like, whoa, hey, I just healed somebody, right? That's kind of how Jesus is in his humanity. But in his divinity, his power just saves, his power restores and redeems. And so he feels it. And he's feeling the power go out, and he says, whoa, 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 who touched me? As he's being bumped around, and his disciples are like, bro, everybody's touching you. What do you mean who touched you? Like everybody's shoving you. And like Jesus and again, Jesus' disciples, you're going to see this as the story continues on in the coming weeks. His disciples are going to kind of grow more and more clueless and more distant to what's happening. And so Jesus ignores them as they say, everybody's touching Jesus. What are you even talking about? And Jesus continues to look and continues to search. And the woman knows she's been caught. And so she comes out before Jesus. She falls on her face, trembling before him. She's scared, right? Because what she's done, she's not supposed to do. She's not supposed to go out and touch anybody, let alone a holy teacher, right? But what she doesn't know is that Jesus isn't made unclean by unclean things. Rather, unclean things are made clean by him. And so he has purified her. And so she's on her face and she's tells him everything. She probably tells him about all the doctors and what had happened to her body and the 12 years that she'd been suffering and isolated and how she believed that if she could just touch Jesus' cloak, she could be made well, and how she touched his cloak and immediately felt the power of him course through her and heal. And she tells him everything, just bears everything before him and really the crowd who's all standing there watching this take place. And how does Jesus respond to this girl? He does not rebuke her. His response is tender. Daughter, your faith has healed you. It's the only place in the Bible where Jesus calls somebody daughter. And this would have been particularly striking because, again, this woman had been isolated for so many years. She'd been cut off from family and friends. She was not connected. She was poor. She was alone. And Jesus saying, you are my daughter, is pulling her back into community, pulling her back into family. And he says, your faith has made you well. Your belief that I am the one that God has sent, your belief that I am who I say I am, and I'm able to do these things, that has made you well. Her faith in who Jesus is and the power that he possesses changes her. Jesus meets her in that moment of desperation and turns things upside down for her. But remember, she's not the only desperate person in this story. Who else was desperate? Jairus. Now put yourself in Jairus' shoes right now. Is Jairus urgent, you think, in this moment to get back to his house? His little girl's about to die. And so you can imagine he's probably there on the shore asking Jesus, I need you to come with me. And she's like, okay, I'm going to come with you. And he's probably like he's trying to get going. And then all of a sudden, Jesus wants to have this encounter with this woman and have this long conversation. And you can just imagine Jairus is kind of pacing in the background, kind of waiting like, hey, this is great and all, but my daughter. And then he sees two messengers from his house coming down the road as Jesus is talking with her. And as Jesus is having this conversation, Jairus is going to receive the worst news of his life. Look at these next verses. While Jesus was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. They approach Jairus. Jesus is in a conversation. They pull him aside. They say, Jairus, she passed. Let Jesus go back and do his thing. He doesn't need to come. You can imagine the heartbreak of this man. All of his hope is extinguished in an instant, just as this woman in front of him has just been healed in an instant, like the reverse has happened in his own heart. And everything just kind of comes crushing down on him. And it's in that moment, Jesus, hearing the conversation, locks eyes with Jairus and says, do not be afraid. Believe. It's like Jesus is saying, don't jump off that cliff to despair yet, Jairus. Trust me. Believe. Fight to continue to believe that Jesus alone can still intervene into your desperation. Verse 37. And Jesus allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he'd entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Right, so this scenario is happening pretty close to Jairus' house, and Jesus says, all right, let's go. And he says, James, Peter, John, you guys, just the three of you are coming in with me. Probably not a lot of room in the house, but we're going to see, again, through the course of this gospel, Jesus is going to invest in these three even further. And they go inside the house. As they enter in, there's all these people that are there. And they're weeping and they're wailing. They're playing instruments. They're making all kinds of noise. And what was pretty normal for this culture was that when somebody passed away, you would hire professional mourners for them. It's kind of like when somebody passes away today and you go in and you're looking at caskets and you end up spending all this ridiculous money on a casket that's going to be in the ground. It's like the how much you spend is somehow a symbol of how much you cared for that person. That's kind of what they're doing. Like, so if you really cared for somebody, you would hire as many mourners as you could. And so they go in, and the house is filled with mourners, making all kinds of noise, because clearly this daughter was beloved by Jairus. But it's also interesting. You don't just flip a switch and send out a text message and all the mourners are there. See, they'd already been making plans for this girl to pass away. The funeral arrangements had already been made. She's been on death's door for a while. They knew it was coming along in order to have enough time to have everybody there before Jesus even gets there. And so this whole thing was ready to go in that moment. And Jesus walks into the room, sees everyone weeping and crying and making commotion. And Jesus says, what are you guys doing? She's not dead. She's only asleep. And you know they don't really care about the girl because of how they respond to Jesus. They don't say to Jesus, oh, you must have really cared or you must be into that. No, they just start laughing and mocking Jesus. They don't really have anything invested in this girl, right? And they're doing their job, and this random rabbi comes in to tell everybody, oh, it's just sleeping. They're like, no, we saw the body. She's dead. And so they mock. They laugh at Jesus. And then Mark tells us Jesus put them out. It's the same word that is used when Jesus casts out demons. So he basically just starts going through the house and says, everybody out. You get out. You get out. Just starts kicking everybody out of the house. And so everybody leaves so that all that is left is James, John, and Peter, and the parents. They're standing there in the silence. And Jesus takes them to where the girl is. Look at verse 41. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And Jesus strictly charged them that no one should know this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Jesus walks in the room, they're all in tow. It feels like death in there, right? It's like, I don't know if you've ever been in a funeral or memorial service when everybody else has left and just, you're there in the silence and the stillness and the deadness of it all. And Jesus is standing there with them. And he grabs the little girl's hand and says this. And it's interesting, Mark quotes what Jesus literally said, because of course the Gospel of Mark's written in Greek, but Jesus would have spoke Aramaic, and so this is the phrase that he uses is an Aramaic phrase. And Peter is the one who was present here, and Peter's the one who kind of was Mark's main source. And you can imagine that this moment just was etched in Peter's mind forever, to where he says, no, say literally what Jesus said as he did this. And the phrase that he uses gets translated to us, little girl, I said to you, arise. It's the same word you would go up and you say, time to get up, sweetheart. It's that kind of familiar, close, tender, sweet moment where Jesus says, sweetie, it's time to get up. Jesus touches this girl, speaks tenderly to her, and she comes alive. Jesus does not perform some ritual. Jesus does not make this huge process to bring about. You can think of a few resurrections in the Bible where the prophets would have to do all this stuff, and not Jesus. Jesus walks in and says, sweetie, let's get up. And it is much like a little kid getting up from a nap. She gets up. She's old enough to walk. She's 12 years old. She starts walking around, and Jesus immediately turns to them and says, I need you guys to keep this on the down low. Right? Because again, the understanding of what it meant to be the Messiah was so convoluted for these people. They had for them, they thought Messiah meant come in and beat up the Romans and put us back on the top. But for Jesus, he knows, no, Messiah is going to mean first death. And so he says, guys, I need you to keep this on the down low, which would be super hard. Everybody knew the girl was dead. And now all of a sudden she's going to show up at school the next day. So they're going to have to explain some of this. But Jesus says, keep it down on the down low. And then I love this little phrase, give her something to eat. Go ahead, put some chicken nuggets in the microwave. She's starving after being dead for a bit. Just Jesus is like concerned for the details, right? Just make sure, get her a little Capri Sun pouch, and get her all set up so she's good to go, gets their energy back. And the people, you can just imagine sitting in this room, seeing Jesus walk in and just speak and raises the dead. And they are amazed. They are blown away. And I just put myself in Peter or John's shoes, just sitting there like, but I can't tell the guys about this, right? I can't tell what just happened. But Jesus, just as he's commanded those demons, just as he commanded the storm, and so now he commands death itself, let go, and raises this little girl to life. Mark inserts a fascinating detail about this girl. I don't know if you caught it, but it's definitely no accident. When he raises her, Mark says she gets up and walks around. Why? Why does Mark say that? What's the reason he gives for why she's able to walk around? Because she's 12 years old. This is on purpose. Has the number 12 come up at all before in this passage? How long was that woman suffering for? 12 years. 12 years. You see, as we look and hear this story, we see that Jairus and this woman are at opposite ends of the spectrum from society, from their circumstances, and even in their suffering, right? So this woman, her suffering, she'd been suffering for 12 years. Had Jairus been suffering for 12 years? No, but he had joy for 12 years that was then ripped from him. So it's like the opposite, but also the same in the sense of the depth of pain, the depth of despair. Jairus was wealthy. He was rich. How about the woman? She'd spent everything she'd had. She was poor. Jairus was a religious elite, accepted in all religious circles. The woman, unclean, cast out, unable to be a part of worship. Jairus was a part of a family and had a close network of friends supporting him. The woman was isolated and alone. Jairus was a man. This girl was a woman. Jairus has a name, but the woman does not. And even though these two figures are at complete opposite ends of economics and society and culture, they are in the exact same place of complete desperation. Both have 12 years of memories contributing to their pain. Both fall on their faces before Jesus, don't they? Both are afraid. Both believe. And Jesus intervenes into both of their lives. See, Jesus is the solution to all despair for all kinds of people. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or where you've gone or what you've gone through. Jesus is the answer. He has the authority over the weather. He has authority over the demons. He has authority over sickness. He has authority even over death. And Jesus will go to the cross to bear the penalty, not just for the poor, but for the rich. not just for the well-connected, but for the isolated. Jesus will go to the cross for all kinds of people, and he alone is the cure to desperation. So what do we do with this passage this morning for us, especially for those of us who are in a specific season of desperation where you're at wit's end and you've tried everything? And here's the big idea for the application for us. It's the same for whether you're a follower of Jesus or not. Here is the application I think that this text holds in front of us. Desperation is the doorway to life with Jesus. Desperation is the doorway to life with Jesus. Here's the reality. You and I, we rely far too much on our own resources to get through our problems. We rely far too much on ourselves and what we bring to the table to get through whatever it is that we need to get through. So when we face problems, our knee-jerk reaction, let's fix it ourselves. We hate to feel like we have to rely on somebody else to rescue us, to help us, to assist us. And so it's why whenever somebody asks you and asks me, hey, how are you doing? What's our response normally? I'm fine. We say that whether the entire world has imploded in on us or whether things are going great. We say, I'm fine. And why do we say I'm fine? Because God forbid you would see just how weak and unable I am to overcome what I'm wrestling with. I'd much rather rely on my resources to get through what I am going through. We want to keep up the appearance that we've got everything covered. But our perceived independence and our mindset, this kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps sort of mindset, keeps us far from Jesus. See, when we think everything is going well, we have very little awareness for just how far from God we really are. And it's only when we exhaust every other option in our lives that we're able to draw near to the power of Jesus by faith. Consider for a moment both the woman and Jairus. If they never have the crisis in their life, do they ever come to Jesus? No, Jairus probably stays comfortable in the religious circles that he's in. It's only the crisis involving his daughter that leads him to seek Jesus out. Same with the woman. If she never has this medical issue for 12 years and she spent everything in complete destitution and desperation, she's not seeking Jesus out. But it's because of those things entering into their life that leads them to run to Jesus because they have no more options. Desperation is what opened the door to both of them to life with Jesus. And the same is true for us. Whatever it is that has you desperate this morning, in this moment, whether it's suffering, whether it is the lack of some good blessing or the presence of some trial in your life, its purpose, its goal, its design is to drive you in that desperation to the only one who can make a difference, which is Jesus Christ. Right, so some of you this morning, you're not yet followers of Jesus. Maybe you're exploring church right now. You're kind of just checking things out. Maybe a friend or a family member has invited you. Maybe you just rolled in off the streets today. I don't know why you're here. But I'm willing to bet that you've got things going on in your life that you are at a place, or you've been at a place where you're like, I don't know that I can fix this. This problem's been too big for me to handle. This challenge, deep down, you know you cannot fix it. No matter how often you try, no matter how often the plans you set up to try to get out of the pit that you are in, it never seems to work. And like these people, often things get worse. And maybe the hits keep coming. Maybe you feel like you just get to this moment where You feel like you're treading water and you've got your head above the surface, but as you do, you see a massive wave coming that's even bigger than all the others, that's crashing and drowning you and throwing you under. And you're like, the hits just keep coming. Friend, you don't need to keep treading water. You don't need to be strong. You don't need to keep everything together. You see, desperation is a great place to be if you let it carry you to Jesus. Desperation is worth it if it gets you to Jesus. So stop fighting. Stop trying to keep from going under on your own strength and power. Don't apologize that you can't do it. Don't apologize that you're a burden to others. Because the reality is, Jesus delights in carrying our burdens. He loves to carry those who cannot carry themselves. But if you still insist on persevering through pain on your own, then you're probably not yet desperate enough. And that's a scary place to be. Because if God has his eyes set on you, and he wants to be in your life and wants you in his life, like Jairus and like this woman, he's going to get you there and draw you to himself. He loves you too much to leave you to your own devices. So if you're ready to surrender to Jesus as the only cure to your desperation, I'd love for you after the service, we're going to have our prayer team will be spread out here. Just walk up and say, I'm desperate and I need Jesus. They'll pray with you, talk with you about what that can look like for you. Now, many of us this morning are followers of Jesus. And for those of you that are, maybe you can think back to when you first started trusting in Jesus. And for many of us, it came in a moment of desperation, didn't it? A season of where you were at, where you felt like you couldn't go on, you couldn't make a difference in your own life, and you came to Jesus. That being said, I'm sure you've probably noticed that you still go through seasons of desperation, don't you? I know I do. But the truth is, why is it that God lets us continue to walk in some seasons of desperation? It's because trials and problems and suffering are all tools that God uses to drive us back to Jesus again and again and again. Because here's the truth. Renewed intimacy and dependence on Jesus await on the other side of desperation. He wants to take you deeper. He wants to take you in closer. See, we experience intimacy with Jesus in our desperation when he delivers us from our trials. And we also experience intimacy with Jesus in our desperation when he carries us through them. But both produce a greater dependence and intimacy with Jesus, and Jesus does both. Man, it's so easy for me to default back into kind of self-dependency mode. It's so easy to mask our vulnerability before others in an attempt to appear strong and to appear like we've got it all together. And when we're in that boat, we need to repent, brother and sister. We need to repent. We don't have to be strong. We don't have to keep a brave face on. We need to stay desperate for the intervention of Jesus. We need to allow our circumstances to drive us back into the arms of Jesus. Jesus says the same thing to you and I in those moments. Do not be afraid, only believe. Jesus will carry you through. And on that last day, Jesus will return for you and undo every pain, every trial, every tear. And how do we know he's going to do all this? Because he endured the same for you and for me. Jesus hung on a cross, desperate and alone, to deliver you and I on that last day from every desperation and fear.